So I feel like I'm making some progress in my snowman scene. I have a long way to go from a design standpoint, so I really want to consider the environment and the composition. But as far as the technical nuts and bolts, I feel like I've come a long way. And the next step in the process is I really want to start to think critically about my lighting and my render settings. And so I have my basic scene set up here, and I'm going to make just a few quick adjustments here. I'm really not taking advantage of the landscape properly. So I'm going to shift this around a little bit, and I'll just make some real quick adjustments. And you know, maybe I'll even make this landscape a bit bigger. But I'm going to save some of those decisions for just this later process, this process work. I started to think about my environment. I want to throw some mountains in the scene to kind of help frame off the background so it doesn't look incomplete. But for now, I'm going to focus on my lighting setup. And so if you remember a while ago, we set up our lights and we set up a real simple 2-point light system. So I have my key light, which is the dominant light inside the scene. It's casting just a real faint blue. And I'm just going to adjust that and add a little bit more blue to the scene. I'm also going to select my fill light. Now, when I created my fill light, I left it named light, and I want to be a little bit more specific about the naming of some of my objects, so I don't have to search through this and try to figure out what's what. With my fill light, I'm going to complement my key light. So, you know, currently I'm casting a blue light inside the environment, and I want to complement that with a yellow or an orangish sort of light. So just like we would use complementary colors in a design to create some sort of contrast, we can do the same thing with our lighting setup. So I'm going to go into my fill light here, and I'm going to slide this hue somewhere in the orange-yellow range. And I'm not going to be too heavy-handed with this, but remember, the intensity of our light is set very low, so we can get, you know, pretty heavy with our colors. And I'm just going to give that a render. And so what that does is it's starting to help create some contrast on the left side of the snowman. Now, you can experiment with your light setup. I threw a blue key light into the equation, which starts to give it kind of more of a nighttime feel. So be careful about the lights that you're introducing into the equation, because you might start sending a message that contradicts the scene that you're setting up. But so far, I'm fairly happy with this. But I want to look at another option that's really going to help our renders start to stand out. And that is our render settings. And I can access my render settings by going up here to the command bar, and we have these 3 render icons right in a row. We've looked at render view, and if we click on that icon, that's just going to render the view, our default viewport. The next render button over, if I click and hold on it, there's a lot of different options here where I can, you know, do a render region, and I can make a selection if I want to just do a real quick render. I'll turn that off. And to the right of that render button is our render settings. And I'll just click on our render settings. And our render settings is going to be the place that when we actually render this and output a file, we can determine what the resolution of that file is going to be and what kind of format it is, along with a whole other list of options. And for now, I'm going to let everything default, but I'm going to look into my effects tab. So if I look down here in the bottom left-hand corner of the render settings, and I click on effects, you can see that I have a whole bunch of effects that I can add to my render. Now, the one that I'm interested in is global illumination. Now, I'm going to select global illumination, and once we do that, you see that we have an additional channel in our render settings, and I'm just going to let everything default for now. And what this is going to do is right out of the box, it's going to dramatically change the quality of our render. And I'll give this a quick render. And what global illumination is doing is it's going to do a multi-pass render, and it's going to calculate bounced light in a much more sophisticated way. So immediately you can see a difference. Our shadows start to lighten up. Our scene starts to change in a fairly dramatic way, and it looks more, there's more luminance in our scene. So what global illumination is doing is it's not just calculating what kind of light is in the scene, but it's also calculating light that's bouncing around the scene. So we're getting a lot more light within our scene. Turn on global illumination, we do start to pay a price for render times. You'll notice that your render time starts to increase because it's a multi-pass render and there's a lot more information to calculate. But once we have global illumination turned on, we want to go back and continue to refine our lights because we're going to get a different quality. In addition to that, global illumination often takes into account our sky. And currently we introduced the sky, and if you remember, that was under the Environments tab just to the left of the camera object. And from that menu, we chose a sky object. So I currently have a sky inside my scene, and I'm just going to create a real simple texture. I'm going to call it blue sky for now, and I'll add a little bit more information to this channel or to this texture a bit later. And I'll set this sky to some sort of a blue. For now, I'll just set it to this blue, and I'll go back and refine it a bit later. This will be a really dramatic example. So I'll drag and drop that onto the sky. And now when I render this, you'll see that the sky is really contributing to the overall light and quality. Again, I was really heavy-handed with that blue, so I'm going to go back and back it off, but you can see how that changed my scene. So I'm going to continue to play with my lights. I'm going to complement these with adding a little bit of color. My shadows are starting to lighten up, and I'm fairly happy with that. But I want to go back and make a pass to the snowman and add a bunch of details based on what I know how to do. I'm going to populate my environment with a lot of different information. I'm going to start to apply textures to things that require textures, and then I'm going to start to think about the composition of my render. And once we start composing our renders and start looking through our viewport in very specific ways, it's not a bad idea to start to implement cameras. And we'll talk about the use of cameras in the next presentation.